The 2009 Iran elections were probably the most controversial of modern democracy. The candidates were Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Mir Hussein Mousavi. After the votes had been tallied up, Ahmadinejad had won. After the results had been announced, protests quickly broke out in the streets. Citizens were claiming that they had voted for Mousavi, not Ahmadinejad. The citizens were demanding a recount, but instead Ahmadinejad responded with attack dogs and riot police. These riots and protests went on for 7 months, eventually put to their end by the police's non-stop violence. The Iranian government reported 27 fatalities. The International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran reported 34, and CNN was reporting over 150 fatalities, citing their sources as Tehran citizens and hospital staff working in the morgues. The Iranian government was blaming these deaths on other illnesses such as heart attack and organ failure. Luckily, there is an organization trying to stop things like this from happening. The Carter Center sends impartial observers around the globe to monitor elections. The Carter Center just recently reached the mark of 100 elections. They monitor elections such as China, Indonesia, the Cherokee Nation, Palestine, and many more. We also have problems like this in the U.S.
Really, after 2000 in the presidential election with Al Gore and George W. Bush, that election law really exploded. And it happened to be right after that that I came out of law school and my federal clerkship and actually moved to New York City. And that whole area of the law increased dramatically, and that included kind of an arms race of hiring attorneys at campaigns. And so if I have a particular expertise, it really is around get out the vote and voter protection. I had several positions with campaigns, including in-house counsel to a few campaigns. There are a few things you can consider kind of, and I'll use this just kind of in layman's term, misdemeanor violations. Oftentimes there are rules about what campaigns are allowed to do in the form of their advertising, of their campaigning, the types of messages they're allowed to use, the location of those messages. There are a few interesting ones. Obviously corporations in their spending, especially in that time, had to report all spending, and they had spending limits in terms of donations to campaigns. And we saw one actually fairly clever one. I think it was Fubu, the clothing company. I think that's who it was. Or it may have been not Spike Lee. One of the supporters of what then was Democratic nominee for governor of New York. A company came out and changed the name of its most popular sneaker to the Carl McCall sneaker, so they could use put his name out there on advertisements without falling into the campaign donation spending limits. That was kind of a gray area, which I was a little uncomfortable with, but you saw it was an interesting way to get around the spending limits of that time. More common is placing advertisements in public space. Those are signs. Campaigns generally get fined for that, and the city takes it down and sends campaign bills. But the most common and probably the most serious are around financing campaigns by individuals or corporations, and especially at that time, hiding the amounts that they would donate. The Supreme Court
appears poised to strike down most of the remaining limits on massive spending by wealthy donors on political campaigns. On Tuesday, justices heard arguments in McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, which has been referred to as the next Citizens United. Republican leaders and wealthy GOP donor Sean McCutcheon want the Supreme Court to throw out aggregate limits on individual contributions in a single 2-year cycle, saying they violate free speech. On Tuesday, the likely swing vote, Chief Justice John Roberts indicated he's prepared to strike down caps on donations to individual candidates, but perhaps not on donations to political committees. The McCutcheon case marks the first major challenge to campaign finance rules since the 2010 Citizens United decision, which opened the floodgates for unlimited corporate spending on elections. For more, we go to Bert Newborn, law professor, founding legal director of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of this week around campaign finance.
Well, the importance of the McCutcheon case is it's the first time people have zeroed in on contribution limitations. The law is that expenditures, if you spend your own money, that's now completely uncontrolled. And so you have these extraordinarily wealthy people, the Koch brothers or George Soros on the other side, pouring huge amounts of their own money in. Nothing can be done about that. Up until now, contributions, though, were treated differently because the idea of a contribution created the possibility of a quid pro quo deal with the candidate. And so contributions could be limited. And there are two kinds of limitations. There's something called a base limitation, which limits the amount that can be given to any particular candidate or any particular committee, and then the aggregate limitation, which is a total that can be given to everybody. The numbers are huge. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. The existing numbers now are $5,200 for a candidate in an election cycle.
That you can give.
That you can give. $32,400 on top of that to the national political party, $10,000 on top of that to the state party, and $5,000 to as many PACs as you want, and there's an unlimited number of them.
So
the only thing that prevents that from spinning out of control I did the math last night, about $3.6 million each election cycle per person. The only thing that prevents that from spinning out of control are the aggregate limitations, and the aggregate limitations are $123,200, and that's what McCutcheon says is too small.
During the oral arguments, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, quote, "By having these limits, you're promoting democratic participation, then the little people will count some, and you won't have the super affluent as the speakers that will control the elections." Justice Antonin Scalia responded somewhat sarcastically by saying, quote, "I assume that a law that only prohibits the speech of 2% of the country is okay." That was Scalia.
That's the gulf that divides the court on these cases. Justice Ginsburg thinks that we should use campaign finance reform to advance equality so that everybody has a roughly equal political influence. Scalia says, look, if you're rich, you're entitled to have as much influence as you can buy. And that's now been the collision, and the Scalia side has won 5-4 consistently in recent years.
At a rally outside by the Supreme Court Tuesday, Senator Bernie Sanders said unlimited private spending undermines U.S. democracy.
The bottom line here is that if we do not want to move this nation to an oligarchic form of society, where a handful of billionaires can determine the outcome of these elections, that it is imperative not only that we overturn Citizens United, but that we put a lid on how much people can contribute in elections. Freedom of speech, in my view, does not mean the freedom to buy the United States government.
And on the other hand, you have Sean McCutcheon's lawyer's comments, this Aaron Murphy, during oral arguments, saying, quote, by prohibiting contributions that are within the modest base limits Congress has already imposed to combat the reality or appearance of corruption, these limits simply seek to prevent individuals from engaging in too much First Amendment activity. Burt Newborn.
Well, that's the collision. The collision is that some people like Bernie Sanders says it is too much First Amendment activity when you can spend so much money that you have a hugely disproportionate influence, and they owe you favors later. What kind of a democracy is that? Ruth Ginsburg put it perfectly. She said if these aggregate limitations go down, 500 people will control American democracy. It will be government for the 500 people, not for anybody else. And that's the risk.
What we need to fix is the fact that people in disadvantaged districts such as these in Columbus, Ohio, with around 1,500 people and less than 6 voting machines, are being shut out of voting because they can't spend money on campaign financing. Republicans have even admitted that these new voter ID laws are aimed at Democrats and the minorities. Ohio is one of the best examples of this.
Look at this. Columbus, Ward 1B, 1,175 voters in the year 2000, 1,620 in the year 2004. Voter registration up 27%. Machines, 2 are gone. 18% increase in registration. They took away a machine. 24%. These are all in Columbus. They took away a machine.
Accusation currently is that the deployment of machines migrated from the inner cities where they had been already placed out to more affluent Republican areas of town, and that this disenfranchised particularly African-American voters and added votes to the Republican side of the ticket. So
in my affluent, predominantly Republican community, where 62% of the people voted for George Bush in the 2000 election, lines were not a problem.
I agree with millions of American citizens that no American should have to wait 4 hours to cast a vote.
This was entered into evidence by the Board of Elections. They have 2,866 machines available. Through a public records request, we found out that only 2,741 voting machines were delivered. What happened to the missing 125 machines, and where did they come from?
We did our voting machine placement, our allocation purely upon registration and past turnout statistics, nothing else.
This shows the machine allocation. Bexley, affluent, upper middle class suburb, right next to the east side of Columbus. No missing machines. Canal Winchester, suburb on the southwest side of the city. Again, no missing machines. As soon as we come to Columbus, where the black population is concentrated, where every elected official on the city council and the mayor are Democrats, somebody has taken the machine identification number and blacked it out. And then they blacked out another one. And then they blacked out another one. Take a look at what happens once you get into the inner city. Virtually every precinct here, somebody has come along and blacked out these machines. As we count it up, it comes to 125 machines. 74% of all the African American wards had less machines than in the primary. This list would have come from the Board of Election. The director is Matt Damschroeder. the former chair of the Franklin County Republican Party.
The state using federal dollars.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm not going to spend too much time giving a long, drawn-out speech. I'll just point out some facts regarding the most recent effort by the Ohio Republican Party and national Republican leaders to disenfranchise voters right here in the Buckeye State. As all of us know, several 100,000 Ohioans are newly registered this year in anticipation of voting for the President of the United States. We believe, as the Secretary of State has pointed out, of the over 700,000 new registrants here in the state of Ohio, more than 200,000 could be at risk for being disenfranchised if the Republican-led effort to seek the federal court's ruling that would reinstate a district court order that requires the Secretary of State to provide the names of new registrants whose registration information doesn't, quote, match the DMV's database to county boards. The federal law at issue, HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, requires the Secretary of State to match any new registrant's information from the statewide voter registration database against the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and Social Security Administration's records and take note of any mismatches. In other words, information that cannot be confirmed by the records that these agencies have. So when a new registrant's data is received from the county boards of elections, the Secretary of State electronically conveys the voters' registration information to the B&V, including their first name, their last name, their date of birth, the driver's license number, and the Social Security number. The B&V, the Bureau of Motor Vehicles here in the state, then matches the information on the registration card to the data in its own system. It then sends the information to the Social Security Administration, which in turn also tries to verify the information. So what could be wrong with that? Friends, I've been an elected official now since late 1992. My name typically appears on the ballot as Chris Redford. My legal name is Christopher R. Redford. That's the name that appears on my Social Security card. Additionally, on my driver's license, it is the same. If I were a newly registered Ohio voter today, or yesterday, or through the course of the summer or the spring, my registration card would be kicked as a mismatch with my B&V and Social Security number. Don't use me as an example. Let's use, the Speaker of the Ohio House, John Husted. Because right now, John Husted's voter registration does not match the name that is on his B&V and or Social Security card.
John Husted, or John A. Husted as it is technically his name, would not be able to get his voter registration card for the same reason as Chris Redford. His name on his Social Security card and his driver's license are not the same. So how do we go about fixing something that infringes on our democracy and makes it harder for the elderly, disabled, and students to vote? We have neutral parties manage the voting machines. Make it so that you just have to show one form of ID to get your voter registration card. And vote for the people who have your best interests in mind.